All right, you intrepid Herle Burly-ites, we have some shiny new context for our discussion today. Regular listeners will know we've been talking about the cost of living and affordability issues here on the pod for the last little while. Well, mere hours before this recording, the Liberal government announced a new affordability package with a $1.6 billion temporary GST cut, plus a Working Canadians Rebate of $250. Does it help a little, a lot? Is it good policy? We'll get into that. And speaking of brand new economic context, what changes will we be seeing down south because of the Trump election? How are they going to affect Canada? And which of the trends we saw in the U.S. politically might happen here because of similar economic circumstances? I want to dive into all that with two of the smartest economic thinkers I know, and boy, I'm damn glad they're here. Both are multi-time Herle Burly guests, Armine Yalnizyan and Jim Stanford. According to Maclean's magazine, Armine is the caring person's economist, a big picture thinker who looks out for the little guy, and the coiner of the term She-cession way back in March 2020 to describe the economic fallout of the pandemic. It's not easy to say, Armine. She's currently the Atkinson Fellow on the future of workers, with a mission to bring a worker's perspective to public policy development. Her work focuses on the care economy and the social and economic factors that determine our health and well-being. Jim is the founding director for the Center of Future Work, a progressive think tank studying how work is changing in the modern economy. He's one of this country's best-known economic commentators, quoted frequently in print and broadcast media, as well as the author of a regular column in the Toronto Star. For over 20 years, he served as economist and director of policy with Unifor, Canada's largest private sector trade union. Jim, Armine, welcome back to the Herle Burly, and thanks for doing it.
Thank you, David.
Great to be here.
So let's take a step back from all this, because everybody talks with the assumption that there is an affordability crisis in the country, and there's some evidence of that. Housing prices do seem unaffordable for most people. You have people with full-time jobs at food banks, so there does seem to be some evidence that there's an affordability crisis. But I want to get your expert opinion. Are we in something unique and different, or does it just feel different to people somehow? Jim, do you want to start?
Well, I'm really glad you asked that, David, because I think people just assume because it's so damn expensive to go to Loblaws and fill up your cart, yeah, there is an affordability crisis. But there's a number of different parts to, a cost of living concern that I think we have to take into account. One is obviously how high are prices on the things that we buy, the stuff we have to pay for out of our own wallets. And obviously, prices are higher than they were a few years ago. We had about 2 years of, rapid inflation. Now, that has gone. We're now into normal inflation, or maybe even a little below normal inflation. But try to explain the difference between the level of prices and the rate of increase of prices to a shopper at the till at Loblaws, and you'll be lucky to escape with your life.
No, so, politically, the issue is not inflation. The issue is cost of living.
Right. Now, What else matters in cost of living? It isn't just the level of prices. It obviously is how much money have you got to pay for that stuff. And yeah, stuff is more expensive than it was 5 years ago. But guess what? Wages and incomes are higher than they were 5 years ago. In fact, wages and incomes have grown faster than prices since 5 years ago. So if you measure what economists call the real wage, that is your average income as a worker, divided by the level of prices, it's higher than it was. And for the last year and a half, since early 2023, wages have been growing faster than prices. And in fact, right now, David, they're growing 3 times faster than prices, which is causing, conniptions among many employer groups in Canada. They worry about it. And I'm sure the Bank of Canada is pulling their hair out as well, because contrary to their theoretical models, we've seen strong wage growth, even though inflation was decelerating, falling, which isn't supposed to happen in their worldview, where usually they worry about wage price spirals and the fact that wages are the main cause of inflation. So yes, prices are up, but wages are up even more. Then there's another dimension of affordability, which is how do you pay for and get other stuff in life other than just what you bought out of your wallet. And this is where, we can think about what, sometimes is called the social wage. Think about the things like public transit or childcare or healthcare, obviously, education, and other things that in Canada, for the most part, we try to give people by virtue of the fact that they live here, rather than the fact that they have to pay for it immediately out of their wallet. And that is an important part of the standard of living that is often ignored. So Yeah, we have to look at the level of prices, no doubt about it, and they're high, and that has had, cultural implications, political implications in America as well as Canada, obviously, and how you talk about that is important. But in terms of what people earn and what they can buy with what they earn, it is hard to say that things are really different today than they were 5 years ago.
Okay.
I would never win election, David, saying something like that. There's the reality.
No, that's right.
I'm not running for anything.
People like that would take that right out of your script. People like me would take that right out of your script. But so, Armine, just to follow up on that then, I don't know if you have the same view or not, but if I was to do a poll right now and I asked people how important any variety of issues was, including their access to health care, the situation in the economy and employment, or the relations with the United States, people would tell me that the number one problem in the country and their number one concern is the cost of living. So if Jim's right, why is that the case?
Because affordability is a problem, but it is very different for different groups of people in terms of what they can afford. And the pain is absolutely real. You see it from the rising number of people using food banks. You see it in terms of the people that are unable to pay for healthcare and they can't get it through the public system. What we're hearing just very recently about the number of people that were involved in the Canada-wide early learning and childcare plan, which was to bring down the price of childcare to young parents to $10 a day, that companies, for-profit companies, are pulling out, and there isn't extra supply to go to that is covered by this, that the affordability concerns all pile on top of the biggest spike in inflation we have seen in 40 years, with the most rapid and historically fastest, steepest increases in interest rates we have ever seen central banks put into place, and they did it all around the world. Is affordability a problem that governments can fix? Well, really, what you've got on top of the actuality of macro versus micro understanding of what's going on, the point that Jim made about the distinction between inflation and price levels. Yeah, inflation has slowed down, but prices are higher. I think it was just today that the opposition leader said that from the time Mr. Trudeau came into government, the price of housing was up by X, the price of food was up by Y. That's almost a decade. And of course, prices are going to go up, even if you only got 2% inflation. But we didn't. We had 2 years of inflation at rates we haven't seen in 40 years. And what people want is prices to go down. They don't want inflation to go down. They want prices to go down. I was at a Bank of Canada 2-day meeting just last week. And the very last speaker over the course of 2 days talking about what are people's expectations on inflation, because that's really where most of the central banks are at, is managing people's expectations, trying to anchor them so that people don't expect higher wages. They don't expect that they can jack up prices, all of that sort of thing. And somebody, like the very last speaker of the day, said, actually, the optimal level of inflation, the optimal rate of inflation for households is negative. And it brought a chuckle from the room. And it's like, yeah, dudes, do you just not talk to anybody? They want the price of gas to go down. They want the price of food to go down. They want the price of housing to go down. These are the basics. And this also taps into what Jim was saying is, can you do something about the price of basics to bring down the cost of living for the things that really are not discretionary? And that is literally what this current federal government has been doing for the last few years. It has brought down the cost of some drugs through pharmacare, the cost of some dental care, the cost of some people's access to childcare. It's a start. It's introduced a national school food program. These are all steps in the right direction to ease the costs on people that are really struggling to cover their basics. And so affordability and cost of living, pain in the ass for rich people that want to go traveling, and the cost of tours and airplane flights have jacked up and they want to see inflation go down. Actually, life and death issues for approximately 40% of the population, a huge portion of whom are children. And we've got falling birth rates. We've got shrinking labor markets because of the rollback in how many newcomers we bring in and the pace of people retiring. you don't want young people ending up not being able to cover their basics. And then you're asking them to do more work than any generation, any working age generation has had to do for 60 years to pay for everything, to support themselves, but also to pay for the care that those who are too young, too old, and too sick to care for themselves need. So we've got a real issue of affordability, 100%, and things that governments can do and have been doing to some extent. But the quick political fix right now is give me my money back, give me a tax cut. And I think that is purely performance art right now.
We've been talking here lately about TELUS's efforts to secure, defend, protect their copper wiring. Pick any of those powerful, unyielding verbs, Herle Burly-ites, their physical infrastructure. That's a mindset that carries over into how they keep and defend more abstract capital, data and privacy. It comes down to this. From cables buried in the ground to your personal information in the cloud, TELUS believes trust is the cornerstone of every customer relationship. And in the context of our advancing digital age, it becomes even more critical. They just got out of field with a poll surveying Canadians and Americans about data privacy and ethical data practices. A few highlights. 79% of Canadians and 82% of Americans believe data privacy matters more now than ever. 87% of Canadians and 88% of Americans consider how a company handles data critical in whether they want to do business with them. 88% say trust in a business inspires them to use its products and services. And when it comes to artificial intelligence, not only do 82% of Canadians and 81% of Americans want it presented with absolute clarity and transparency, 74% say they want AI developed in consultation with regular folks, not just academics or tech people. As technologies like AI continue to evolve, TELUS knows it's on them to bolster their core trustworthy data practices. They were the first organization in the world to achieve Privacy by Design ISO certification, the first telecom to sign the Fed's voluntary AI Code of Conduct, and they're regular leaders and participants in international forums to influence the continuing development of data and technology practices. All nice achievements, Herle Burly-ites, but the key message is this. When it comes to efforts to strengthen trust and technology, TELUS just won't stop. Learn more at telus.com/trust. Okay, let's delve into this a little just deeper because, we can talk about people at the very low end of the income scale who obviously would have real difficulty adjusting to the rising price of shelter and food that occurred during this inflationary period, maybe transportation. But people who make like $120,000 a year are angry about the cost of living, right? Angry and voting on that basis, so governments are responding to them. What's changed in the life of somebody that is at that income level? Jim?
Mortgage rates.
Mortgage rates? Yeah.
Well, interest rates are obviously part of the challenge that many households have been experiencing. And interest rates do show up in our consumer price index. There is a component in Statistics Canada's measure of inflation that does capture interest rates. And this was a big irony of the Bank of Canada's response to inflation was to jack up interest rates, which actually literally made inflation worse for a while because the higher debt charges that households with mortgages had to pay showed up as higher inflation. At one point, it was about a full percentage point of our inflation rate was due to the Bank of Canada's interest rate hike. So we do feel those impacts, and ironically, they do show up in the inflation rate. So what I said earlier about wages on average being higher than prices in real terms includes that interest rate effect. But again, I absolutely confess that I don't have a lead on the psychology of that and how it's experienced. To some extent, yes, people at the lower end obviously have a harder time with that. And that has always been true. And in fact, in Canada, wages at the bottom have been growing faster on average than wages in the middle or at the top. There's been a modest compression in wage inequality through the last couple of years, which is a very positive thing. But again, doesn't explain people's outrage, let alone somebody, like you said, David, who's got a comfortable middle class or upper middle class income who also is pissed off. So, again, as an economist, I have to confess that I don't have the necessarily the read on psychology. I see what the numbers tell me, which is, yes, there was a terrible pandemic. Yes, there were aftershocks to that pandemic, one of which was inflation. But people's actual standard of living in Canada is not lower than it was in 2019. On average, it's higher. So how do you translate that into the sort of gut level anger that is obviously out there? I won't deny that it's out there. And I think economists around the world have been puzzled to try and understand that. It could be a gap between people's hopes and expectations and what they're experiencing in life. It could be misinformation or bad reporting from people. People are obviously influenced, not to deny their real experience, but they're obviously influenced by what they read on social media about, what's fair and what isn't fair, and even what they read in newspapers. And there's been a lot of critical understanding and analysis of the American media and its coverage of economic issues before and during the election campaign there. Which, just absolutely missed the boat, including on this point of should prices fall. I mean, yeah, we could get prices to fall. The last time that happened was the 1930s. Prices fall during a depression in a general sense. That's not to say you can't do targeted measures, including the things that Armine mentioned, all the things the government can control and directly regulate. We actually do much more of that than is often assumed in Canada. We have lots of regulated prices, and government has a role to play in that. But in terms of the general level of stuff that you buy everywhere, including the grocery store, we don't want those to fall, because if they fall, we're going to be wearing barrels like we were in the 1930s. So,
wait, if I could stick with you for a second on this, Jim, and I don't expect you to comment on politics, but Jagmeet Singh seems to think prices could be lower. So everybody else is talking about how do we give people more money to deal with it. But Singh, in addition to that, also seems to think that the business sector has been profiting off of this, and the business sector has been gouging people. And there's room in there to force grocery stores to lower prices or to force other people to lower their prices.
Well, he's certainly true that companies have profited. They especially profited at the beginning of this inflationary upsurge. So in 2022, when inflation hit 8% in Canada, profits hit their largest share of GDP in Canada's history. So there was absolutely a correlation, and he's 100% correct on this, that companies took advantage of the uncertainty and the disruptions and the shortages, the energy price shock, and their competitive power to lift prices more than they had to. So that's absolutely true. Now, how do you back up from that? First of all, what we should do is take a good lesson from that and realize that when disruptions occur, you want to be on the lookout for price gouging activity and be ready to stop it. And this is, Armine and I are both fans of Isabella Weber in the U.S., who's been advocating a more active role for price controls of different types, buffer stocks to try and stabilize prices in the event of a shock. But that's ancient history now. That's 2 years ago. Profits have come down at the same time as inflation has come down. And I think this proves our point that the upsurge in inflation was due to profits. They're still healthy. I wouldn't say that the corporate Canada is suffering in any regard, but it's a different environment today than it was 2 years ago. So I think that there are long-term structural changes that we could make in competition regulation, in how we manage the housing market, in things like corporate taxes, and the whole idea of using excess profit taxes during shocks and bursts of inflation to prevent it in the future. But in terms of what we want to happen right now, again, there are some things that definitely should be cheaper. Housing is probably the first and foremost of them, and some of the other public services that we've been talking about. But in general, we do not want the general level of prices to fall. I keep stressing this because that is what happens in a depression. And the only way it can happen is if people don't have purchasing power to buy anything. And that's what causes the overall level of prices to decline. And it's a very, very bad thing.
Yeah. So, give your head a shake. If you're like me, it's full of stress-inducing political chaff, the result of midnight doom scrolling for the past several weeks. The American election campaign was a blizzard of jeremiads, a confection of obsessive emotion and apocalyptic culture war rhetoric supercharged by social media. Take a breath. Now take another one. Canada has an economy to manage, and it happens to be utterly integrated with the United States of America. That's actually literally true. Our supply chains are in fact the same. About $3.6 billion crosses the common border each day. Agriculture, manufacturing, services, all integrated. The cattle herd in America and the cattle herd in Canada are just about genetically identical. This is stuff that really matters, people. Happily, the leadership of both our political parties seem to have already taken that deep breath. Both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition have declared that economic collaboration must and will continue, come what may. Our sponsor, CN, applauds that approach. Listen for a second to a few of CN's stats. 32% of CN freight traffic moves cross-border. 16% is entirely within the United States. CN employs 6,825 American railroaders. It operates 5,400 miles of routes in the U.S. It spends more than $4 billion on its operations there. To be clear, it is in everyone's interest, that cross-border trade and commerce continue unimpeded. Politics is politics, and most Canadians have, shall we say, another view. But the integrated economy is our way of life. In the weeks ahead, we'll hear all sorts of doomsday scenarios, just as we have for decades. But the truth is that millions of Americans and millions of Canadians interact and do business every week. And they do it in a competitive, rules-based system that acts to the benefit of all. It is, in fact, the envy of the world. So, onward, as they say. Okay, Armine, despite what Jim says, every government in the country is responding with policy instruments to this affordability demand. No matter what their politics are, they're cutting gas taxes, or they're cutting sales taxes, or they're writing people checks, or they're doing something. Everybody's doing it. You wouldn't do any of that?
Oh, well, I would never be elected like Jim. So I would never have to worry about it. But I think everybody wants a fast fix, and politicians are in the business of winning the beauty contest. And the beauty contest involves, I see your pain and I'm here to help you. Tax cuts, or even just like the handout for the workers' benefit, any kind of income related thing is a fast fix. It says, I see you. It doesn't fix anything, but it does say, I see you. It gives you back your money. If it's a tax cut, it takes money from somebody else and gives it to you if it's a transfer that is targeted in some way. And it will help. And the more targeted it is for people that are really hurting, the more of a fix it will be. But it's a one-hit wonder type of fix. It does nothing about the level of competition in a sector like food or telecom or housing that would permit people with larger market share to be price setters. It does nothing to demarketize access to the basics like childcare, healthcare, long-term care, housing, dental care, pharmacare, all of which we are working on at the federal level, and have been for a number of years. God bless them. Not as fast as anybody would like, not as effectively as people would like, but moving in that direction. And had the presidential election turned out differently in the United States, we would continue to have a focus on regulation, on competition, on care and the role of care and access to care when people need it, so that they can be productive, so that they're not looking over their shoulder and wondering, I'm sick, or my child is sick, or my parent is sick, and I'm not sure how much I can work. And I just want to reinforce something I said before. Because of demographics, because of a baby boom that took place in every country that was part of the Second World War, and falling birth rates, in virtually all the rich countries in the intervening decades. We have more people exiting the labor market than entering it, unless you flood the market with newcomers, which we are now creating a narrative about antipathy towards the newcomer. For better or worse, that's a whole other topic. But it does change the price of labor. It changes the power of labor. If you've got tight labor market conditions. When Jim was talking about rising wages at the bottom being faster than at the top, I wrote a series for the Toronto Star. I'm also a contributing columnist for the Toronto Star. The series was called Wage Rage. And my business editor asked me to address the fact that some union agreements were double-digit agreements, and that person was freaked out that that was going to spill over into higher costs for them. And so they dubbed the series the Wage Rage series. And the second of those three parts was about the wage compression Jim was talking about, but generalized upward mobility. There are fewer really crappy paying jobs in the bottom quartile of the job distribution. There are a whole lot more jobs in the very top quartile of the job distribution. People are moving out of crappier jobs and moving into better jobs. How do you convince them that that's happening? You can't. My takeaway from these last few months and how some political parties have fed the rage machine is that when we talk about the success of our economy, and it is tremendously successful, when we talk at macro levels, at average levels, economics for the average voter, for the average person, is a micro issue. It is completely about what they are experiencing. And you can tap in, you can press that buzzer in everybody's life to say, I'm not getting what I want to get. Basically, what they're doing is feeding the toddler in us to say, give me back some money right now, instead of saying, use that $250 per person across, what is it? I think it's something like 20 million workers last year. So if you filled out your tax form and there were 20 million of you working, it's $250 across all of those people. Can you imagine what we could buy by pooling those resources? But no, what we want is the money in my pocket right now. And so, even toddlers can be encouraged to wait for the sweet stuff that comes down the road. If you just defer a little bit of your pleasure right now, you get actually a lot more pleasure over the long haul. But we're not taught to think that way at all. And I think that's it's an issue of economic literacy for sure, but it's also an issue of it really taps into this me first culture that we are swimming in all over the world. Whether it's, we've gone past peak globalization, whether it's Russia first, UK first, America first, maybe Canada first in a few months. This whole idea of me first is actually a reflection of a very not collectively oriented society anywhere that is rich.
Our forests have long been at the heart of an important interplay between rural and urban Canada. Our country was built on forestry, and this dynamic is as important today as it ever was, maybe more so. Here's how Canadian forestry is making a difference. As we look to the needs of our country in the coming years, forestry has a clear role to play in providing sustainable solutions. Whether it's modular wood-based solutions, we need to build more homes quickly, or producing the renewable energy that will heat them. Canadian forestry is finding new and creative ways to solve for some of our most pressing challenges. And all of this is done with a renewable resource that is responsibly managed by a sector that supports over 500,000 jobs in communities across the country. Our country was built on Canadian forestry, and it can use this resource to continue to grow. In a time when our world is changing, it is essential that our government recognize the most powerful tools we have. Canadian forests are one of them. For more information, visit forestryforthefuture.ca. Right, but something has provoked that. I mean, I'm still a little skeptical of what you're both saying. And I've been wondering whether we're measuring the right things or not, because I know a long time ago that Canadians stopped caring about whether the GDP was growing or not, because they didn't believe that had any relationship to their standard of living. And I mean, the United States just gave us a very sharp view of this, in which every economist says the economy under Joe Biden was roaring in the United States, in part because of massive government spending, but whatever, it was roaring in the United States. But almost to a person, Americans disagreed with that. Why, Jim?
And it was.
Do you think there's anything to the fact that we're not measuring the right things?
It was especially roaring, David, for low-income workers, lower-wage workers in the United States. You've seen increases in real wages for the bottom half of the labor market in the last 4 years that have been the best since the early decades of the post-war boom, and have reversed a lot of the widening inequality in wages that we had seen for many years before. Again, if I had the answer, I would have helped Kamala Harris win that election, including through her proposals on things like childcare and regulating grocery prices. That was one of her first, ideas that she threw in there. A pretty mild one. It was, about making price gouging laws, which are currently exist in many U.S. states, but making it a national consistent framework. And the conditions for that were pretty pretty tight. So I'm not sure what impact it would have had, but at least it was focusing some attention on that corporate side of the inflation that people were experiencing, and it didn't work in that electoral sense, anyways, for all kinds of reasons that David, you need to find the answer for. That's what you get paid for.
That's because you're assuring me that the economy is good and people are wrong.
Right.
That's right.
So yeah, people want more from life, and they should want more from life. I have this conversation with my old friends in the union all the time because part of this wage rage that Armine was talking about was these agreements, some of them that with double-digit wage increases that had your business editor pulling their hair out. Many of them got rejected by the members of the unions for not being high enough. Which was also astounding, and obviously for unions, it meant they had to go back and try and get some more still, and the good unions did that. So it is one of the reasons why wage growth is so strong in Canada right now, and that's a very, very, very good thing. So I do think this is more in the realm of culture and psychology, perhaps collective psychology, than it is in the realm of economics. And I am studying this and trying to learn it myself, but I do not dispute the numbers that I see in front of me. I do think we're measuring some of the right things when we measure wages. I've never said, GDP is what counts, but wages in people's pockets count, and that's what I'm measuring, and they're up in real terms and improving quite quickly. This, in some ways, should be a cause for celebration, and in Canada's case, I would say a cause for pride. Why have our wages recovered from that pandemic burst of inflation quicker than most other industrial countries, and not as strongly as in America, but much stronger than in Europe or Australia or other countries where real wages are still much lower than they were when the pandemic hit? And I think it's testament to the strength of our labor market institutions. We've had most provinces, not all, most provinces increase minimum wages quite significantly above the rate of inflation, and that has helped. We have trade union representation in Canada that isn't high enough by my books, but has been relatively stable at around 30% of the labor market for the last 15 or 20 years. And that's different than many other countries where unions have been eroding. And then you've had unions that are willing to use their collective strength, as we've seen time and time again over the last couple of years, to try and negotiate. These are all good things. Again, business hates it. And it's one of the reasons that business is trying to engineer and support a big change in direction in policy, provincially and federally. But for average workers, this is an indisputably positive thing. And, part of my message when I talk to union audiences is, yeah, we're angry and we want more and we're going to fight back. But by the way, we should be proud of what we've done together. And maybe if a bit more of that message got out, then maybe some of that public mood might be different. I don't know.
I think it's really a question of not only what do we measure, but what do we talk about? What are the measurements we talk about?
Yes.
So much of the oxygen in the last 6 months have gone in Canada to how Canada's productivity has flagged what has happened in the United States, which, by the way, it has since the 1980s. And since roughly the 1980s, our productivity measure has been largely wrapped around investments in oil and gas. But productivity and GDP per capita becomes this kind of dialogue of the foreheads in the National Post, the Financial Post, and the Globe and Mail report on business, at the Bank of Canada. You know, you have the senior deputy governor of the Bank of Canada delivering a speech that says it's a break the glass moment in productivity. It's like, I do not think so. It's the same freaking trend that it has been for a while. And yet, you know, that particular phrase whipped up so much sentiment in the mainstream press that the measurement that we need to be paying more attention to is this ephemeral measurement that talks about some kind of per capita measure as if everybody's going to do better. I mean, the countries that have the highest per capita levels are tax havens or oil producing jurisdictions, or places where there's a lot of, you know, inequality. So it says nothing about the distribution of GDP per capita, but we love to talk about it.
There was a graph that went around. It was a meme. Everybody saw it. That showed 350 countries, and Canada was at the bottom in terms of productivity.
The graph was wrong, David.
To your point about
it's in good company with other false memes.
You know what we've got going on here in terms of the measurement. We've got all the measures we want in the world, which actually makes me want to raise my hand up with one thing about the presidential election and what it means for data and how we measure things. In 1982, Reagan came in and tried to kill the census. In 1984, Mulroney tried to kill the census. Both countries were rebuffed by the business community saying, we need access to the census. As taxpayers, we've already paid for it. We want that data. We don't want to pay for other data when this is the best data. So that attempt at killing the census was canned. In 2011, we had a little mental stroke with the loss of the mandatory long-form census, which is the way we collected really important data that is the spine of so many of our other surveys. In the United States, they are guaranteed to kill further future surveys. They don't like official statistics. And people are starting to talk about how are we going to archive the statistics we do have, because they'll kill the statistics, just like they want to ban the books. So when you talk about what measures are we talking about, I think we're beyond what metrics are we using and do we have the right facts on how we're performing. I think we're totally in a world of narrative, which is partly, you know, what narrative is the most compelling? You don't have as much as you deserve. Let me give you your taxes back. Quick fix, quick identification of the problem, quick fix. Except that fix will not fix your problem of affordability and cost of living. The fixes that will are much longer term, and they take collective resources. And frankly, cutting taxes at a time when the population is aging and we're going to have to spend more, not less, is crazy town policy material. Because nobody wants to raise taxes. Why would you cut them, though? Why would you cut them in permanence? That's why I think the most recent move on the part of the Liberals to cut the GST for 2 months.
2 months,
right? To cut.
You're the expert on polling, David. Is that going to make any difference to people's minds? The 2 months thing that kind of raises your eyebrows. Everybody's going to say 2 months. 2 months.
It's like a Christmas present,
right?
Yeah,
I guess so.
And politically, the carbon tax increase is coming to probably more than offset in political terms this cut, but we'll see. I mean, it will be well received by people, I think.
Yep.
Oh, sure. No one's going to send the money back.
Yeah.
I think it will be well received. Now, Don Drummond would say, if he was on this, I believe this because I had a panel with him. Don Drummond would say, they're just taking $250 from an infant and giving it to me so that I can feel better. That this is all, governments can't afford to do any of this. That this is all just stealing from the future now because of the deficits that they're running. And so people who are relatively comfortable are going to get money from the government that the government doesn't have to give them. Jim?
Well, the government does have the money to give them. And in fact, the government does give money to infants, or at least to the parents of infants, through this enormous national childcare program, which is a wonderful thing that Don Drummond, I'm sure, doesn't like because of the cost. So this argument about taking from infants is nonsense. That's been around for ages. You know what we're really taking from infants and the children of infants is what we're doing to the climate. And so, I don't buy this intergenerational thing at all. The government has all kinds of resources that it can spend and allocate as it sees fit. So, and there's going to be competing visions on how to do that. And Armine is right. The emphasis on tax cuts is going to come from people who would prefer to increase their personal income, and especially if it's an income tax cut rather than other cuts, it absolutely will benefit well-off people and starve the resources for either transfers or public programs like the child care program that actually do enhance the affordability of life, if you like. And again, this is where this affordability term and concept just has to be interrogated. It is not just how much you pay for stuff. It's how much you have to spend, what you have to pay for versus what you don't have to pay for, and who's profiting from how much you pay for it. If I was to step back and say, I don't want the instant fix, Armine's quite right. There is no instant fix to this. I would say, how do you solve that more multidimensional affordability crisis? Number one, you keep people's incomes growing. So that means supporting higher wages for workers and higher incomes for other people who need it through transfer payments. The disability benefit would be a good one to move forward on. Number two, make the essentials of life more affordable. So that includes the things that the government helps to provide or regulates, but it is also going to have to include housing. The fact that housing has been become a speculative, financialized asset rather than a roof over your head is core to the housing affordability problem. So we're going to need a rethinking of housing to make sure there's more non-market options available. But that's not an overnight solution. That's going to take decades. And then third of all, challenge the greed that has been driving so much of this. It isn't government that sets these prices. I loved it when Mr. Poilievre put out a tweet saying, the Liberal NDP government has doubled housing prices in the last in the time that they've been in office. The government doesn't set housing prices. Canada is one of the smallest public housing stocks in the world. Maybe 3% of our housing in Canada is actually owned by the government, and it isn't the federal government by and large. It's 97% owned by private asset owners, whether it's individual homeowners and the development companies and the real estate agents, and of course the investment housing industry and the rental units. Those are the ones who increase the price that much. So we should at least start by recognizing the structural forces and self-interests that are behind these things, rather than just assuming that anything bad is government's fault. We live in a capitalist economy where most decisions are made by people with money. So if something bad is happening, chances are it's their fault, not government's fault.
Although local governments have been fingered pretty heavily in the housing crisis because of development charges and zoning.
Yeah, usually the zoning in particular is catering to people with money. So you're right, government can influence all of these things, but government doesn't set the price. And that's where Mr. Poilievre's tweet was just misinformation.
Boomers, Gen X, Millennials, Gen Z, whatever pithily named generation you belong to, Herle Burly-ites, safe to say we all have beliefs about one another. A common theme we hear often from all generations revolves around younger generations and their money. The kids these days, they don't know or care about money the way we used to. They just don't save or invest enough toward important financial goals. Sound familiar? Well, it's a crock. Our sponsor, Fidelity Investments Canada, has a wealth of research on different demographics and their relationship with money. Their insights on younger Canadians prove my point. According to the 2024 Fidelity Young Canadian Study, in collaboration with Ipsos, 18 to 34-year-olds are highly engaged with their finances. 6 in 10 invest in mutual funds, ETFs, individual stocks, and savings accounts. And the number one goal for investing? Retirement. Even though it might be a half century away, followed closely by saving for emergencies and saving for a home. Maybe the most notable data point is this. Over half of young Canadians believe individuals should start investing as early as 18 years old. Impressive, eh? So to all the young people starting their investing journey early, Fidelity salutes you, because compounding matters and investment performance matters.
I just want to go back to, does it make any difference that you gave a two-month tax break starting in December the 14th going to February the 14th? It's really smart retail politics for a few reasons. First of all, you're taking the sting out of it looks like you're doing something to take the sting out of tighter budgets during the holiday season. And just a quick reminder that business insolvencies are at the highest level that they have been since 2009. By giving people more purchasing power, you are also helping local economies. To some extent, you're helping the ecosystem of business that is out there, because it's the smaller businesses that are failing right now. The ones that, clung on by their fingernails during the pandemic and then couldn't find labor and then had interest rates go up. It's like, these are the people that need you to shop there.
Okay.
It plays that role.
There's two elements to the federal proposal today. And I presume you don't have exactly the same view of both of them, Armine. One of them is the GST holiday, and the other is the $250 check. Do you think of them as the same or different?
I kind of think of them as the same thing. I kind of think of them as a kind of holiday stimulus package dressed up in different clothes. And the reason is because who's going to vote against this in Parliament? So this was my second reason. So it's an actually interesting version of stimulus over the holiday season when businesses need you to do something. Number two, Parliament has been in a logjam. It's been a stalemate for a month.
Yeah.
So the GST cut gives a nod to the NDP, whose idea it basically was, except don't do it permanently and don't charge an excess profit tax to pay for it. It gives a nod to the endless repetition of axe the tax of the Conservatives. So it's flattering both of those teams. It also gave them a chance to say how much else they have done other than these two little boutique things. And then it is an opportunity to loosen the logjam for at least this one measure, make it look like Parliament is doing something, not just sitting there fighting and filibustering. But the third element of this is that because it is temporary, because it is one-off, when it comes time to do something for the next budget, which is their last budget, it's their Hail Mary budget before the election, they haven't blown the wad, right? Like they could recycle some of this money. What they did with the GST cut is $1.6 billion. Mr. Singh's proposal was $5 billion for eternity, right? So this is, if nothing else, artful retail politics.
Yeah. Jim, I want to return to something that you said, because I know it's tempting to think of tax cuts as a conservative right-wing issue and a rich people's issue. Mm-hmm. But my polling tells me that working class people want a tax cut right now more than affluent people do.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I don't doubt the polling, just like working class people in America elected Trump. So, what does that tell you? I'm not saying that working class people don't know what's good for them. That would be wrong. But if you think, if you've decided for whatever reason that government is the problem and that's why you're poor, then you'll be susceptible to these types of arguments. Now, the $250 for all working Canadians, I'm surprised they didn't call it hard-working Canadians. Is symbolic. It is. You could say mildly progressive, because the $250 means a lot more to someone at the bottom than it means to someone at the top. Mm-hmm. And it's in effect a negative tax, and it will be netted out against the taxes that people do pay in their income tax. I think they've probably learned from that GST credit. Remember, they gave the extra GST credit a couple of times Once they even called it the grocery rebate, right? Because people were furious about food. And it, in essence, was a GST, doubling of a GST credit for a short period of time, which I think was, valuable and important. But that GST credit is very targeted at low-income people. So that's, I think, positive for equality reasons, but maybe not as effective politically, because that's probably one of the reasons they went for this, give everybody $250. And Doug Ford came to the same conclusion. So, I'm not surprised that that your results show that, David. And I think it, in a way, is another sign of the strangeness in politics. I mean, we know that well-educated, higher-income people are more likely to vote NDP now. So, that shows you how the traditional arguments and base of left parties is changing rapidly and in unexpected ways. And obviously, south of the border and in Canada, progressive parties have to understand what's happening and think about their messaging, their communication, and their priorities, and find different ways to do that. And that goes for other forces, not just political parties. It certainly goes for trade unions as well, to think about how unions are going to phrase their demands in the broader social and political arena and keep their members on side with those demands.
All right. I want to talk about a few things we saw in the States and talk about their applicability or not to Canada. And one of them is the renewed debate around liberalized trade. It's a debate that doesn't happen in Canada since we seemingly settled that issue in 1988. There's been, near as I can tell, an all-party consensus around NAFTA and around trade agreements around the world. Americans are turning against those trade agreements, particularly NAFTA, and the conclusion is that they have weakened the American economy, that they've hollowed out the center of the economy, and places like Ohio, that used to vote Democratic, now vote reliably Republican. And I think of my experience here in Canada, which is that places like Windsor and London, Ontario, used to vote reliably Liberal, and now you can't get elected there. And I'm wondering whether there is an unease or unhappiness, or if our free trade arrangement has changed the nature of work in Canada, such that we actually have that kind of angst in the Canadian population, but there's nobody giving political voice to it, like Trump gave political voice to it in the United States. Jim, are you now a fan of free trade?
No. I oppose the free trade agreement and oppose the extensions of it and opposed China's entry to the WTO. And we, in fact, predicted much of what happened, saying that it was going to wipe out much of the traditional manufacturing base. And that has indeed happened. Now, the problem with critiquing free trade is going to be how do you unscramble the omelet? And the Brits discovered how hard it is to unscramble the omelet. Once you've reorganized your whole production network around a continental system, rather than, we were pretty much around a continental system anyways, but had more of a Canadian focus. Once you've reorganized that, then something like a break in those trade relationships could be catastrophic. So Trump's tariff, if it was applied against Canada at the end of the day, would have an enormous impact. So would his threats to rip up all of those technology subsidies and things like the Inflation Reduction Act and all of the supports for energy transition and electric vehicles and so on. If he rips up all that stuff, then it's going to be an existential moment for all of the investments that we've been trying to build in Canada that would feed into that, the battery plants and the electric vehicle manufacturing and so on. So now, I think, again, your point is more about politics in a way than about economics. People have been hurt. Those communities have been hurt. There are things that have come in to fill the space. Some of them are good. Some of them are not so good. But I think, in a way, giving voice to the kind of the bigger feeling of a lack of opportunity and security in life is the issue, and that can get easily pigeonholed into certain sort of high-profile issues. Free trade agreements might be one. Immigration would be another, as Armine pointed out, how that's becoming a scapegoat for everything. Taxes can be another, where people's life chances feel constrained. Goddamn government, I'm paying a carbon tax. So, again, I think it's, if there's a failure on the progressive side of things, it would be to, I think, develop and enunciate and communicate a narrative that tries to explain what has happened, and who has profited from it, and what are the non-easy, non-immediate fixes that could help to solve it. And that's a big project, David.
All right. Okay, Armine, let's talk about immigration. Because you mentioned that it was people were being scapegoated, but the government's admitted it got this wrong. And I find it, as a layperson, hard to imagine that the number of people coming into the country hasn't had an influence on the housing prices and shelter prices in the country, and hasn't had an impact on the job opportunities that young people have. And that isn't really the immigration number as much as that's the temporary foreign workers numbers and the foreign student numbers. So, obviously there's an enormous backlash about immigration in the States, but they have a different issue. And in Canada, my sense is that people don't have a nativist rejection of immigration. They have a practical objection to immigration, which is too many, too quickly, without the infrastructure to absorb it. Go.
What is happening to housing and healthcare because of an influx of more people just piles on to already chronic underinvestment in what was happening to housing and healthcare for over a decade. So you're not incorrect, but it is not fully correct that the addition of demand did make things harder. But let's just remember there are two sides to this coin. Just like free trade promised us lower prices and said in parentheses, of course, your wages will go down and you'll lose jobs, but don't we all just want lower prices? This is the Zellers period, right? Lower prices are the law. Turned us all into consumers.
And where's Zellers today, I ask? Where's Zellers today?
But
I don't know, but I can get a flat screen for $300. So.
But my point here is that free trade was pitched to us not on how it would make our lives better as workers, but how it would make our lives cheaper as consumers. And it delivered on that front. It just happened to take away our ability to make a living for a lot of people. Now, I do want to say that I want to return to the trade thing just for a moment. What we're talking about is merchandise trade. Now, of a $3 trillion economy, which is the Canadian economy, half of it, $1.5 trillion, is in trade. Two sides, exports and imports. 80% of what we export goes to the US, and the biggest export is oil and gas. 50% of what we import comes from the US, and the biggest import is cars. So whatever happens to trade in merchandise is hugely important. But as GDP, 75% to 80% of both GDP, what we make, the money we generate, and the jobs we have come from services. So yeah, trade is hugely important on how we generate activity, but not hugely important in terms of where the jobs are coming from. And so this goes now to the immigrants. Since 2019, 96% of all job growth, and it was, I think, over 1.5 million jobs created since the pandemic hit. 96% of those jobs went to newcomers, of whom almost all were temporary foreign workers, because the immigrants that we had here, by and large, were also aging. Our population is aging. People are leaving the labor market because they're retiring. And because of falling birth rates for 4 or 5 decades, which are plummeting now for a whole set of reasons, we have fewer people entering the labor market than exiting it. In fact, over the next 15 years, 7 million people are going to be aged into the seniors category, and 6 million will be entering it just from our own population. We need newcomers. Unless we have rather large scale technological changes. And that's what we're seeing here is just like the collapse of the ecosystem of business. Small businesses are collapsing.
Why?
Now, I said earlier that it's the highest rate of insolvencies we've seen since 2009. We are losing the ecosystem, and larger players are owning bigger and bigger market shares. That has impacts on who gets what workers they need at what price, and who sets what prices for the things we buy. Also, who lobbies governments for changing rules on everything, on regulations, on taxes, on labor laws, on all of it. So I think we're entering a period where it is extremely difficult to convince people we need more guardrails, because we have 40 years of being told the market will solve everything. Well, the market is screwing up everything right now. And I think this is, when you were talking earlier about what measures are we using the right measures to talk about things? I don't think we talk enough about who owns stuff, who's coming in to buy everything, right? I just learned this week that private equity is the biggest owners of residential real estate in the United States. They don't give, they're the biggest landlords in the United States. They don't really give a crap what your affordability problem is. They're just going to milk it for what they can. So I think we need to be paying much more attention to ownership structures, not just what is our economic performance, but who's pulling the strings in the system that we're going to have moving forward, whether there's tariffs or not.
Okay. My last question, if you'll indulge me, since we're at our time, but if you'll indulge me one more question. I want you to try to solve a political conundrum for me, and that is the rightward political shift of young men. And we saw a massive shift from the last election to this one, from people who voted for, the kind of people who voted for Biden, this time voted for Trump, young men. Young women are not turning conservative. Young women are as progressive or more progressive than they've ever been. And that is true in Canada and the United States. You get this tremendous bifurcation of the under 35 vote between women who are now, increasingly interested in the NDP of among other things, and young men who are probably 50% of them voting for Poilievre right now. And there's a big discussion going on in politics about how much of this is culture and how much of this is economics, that there simply is a real economic roadblock to young men now, whether it's through the education system or whether it's through the kind of work that they want to do, etc. That means that they're facing less opportunity, not just than previous generations did, but also less opportunity than their female counterparts are facing. So can you demystify this for me? What are the economics of being a young man right now?
Are you going to ask the non-young man or the non-man?
I'm asking the two data-driven economists that I am here talking to.
I'll step up to the plate with a couple of economics. Women have not been able to form relationships with men to a greater and greater degree. They've been left to fend for themselves. They've been going to post-secondary education at a more rapid rate than men because they can see they have to take care of themselves and they have to have the qualifications to compete to get the job. So they've got higher rates of educational completion. They've got more drive to try and make it on their own than men have had recently because they feel like they're going to be forever alone. They're going to be the cat ladies, right? And so they've been also trying to save enough money to get into the housing market at a faster rate than single men who tend to live at home, which brings us back to dough, right? People are not getting together as frequently. The rate of being never in a relationship continues to rise for young men at a much rapider rate than for young women, which I find absolutely shocking because the men aren't moving out of their parents' places. The women are trying to get away from their parents. It's just a really interesting dynamic here, which makes men feel like, so they're not trying as hard as the girls for a series of reasons. And then they feel like they've lost out. So when a man comes along and says, these girls are getting too uppity and I'm here to actually vouch for you, they're looking for somebody that's a fighter for their cause. And Harris was not a fighter for their cause because Harris was busy fighting for the women's cause of having control over your own body, because that's where they're at in the United States. And can I just say, as a woman, it's terrifying that we are having this conversation again. So if you're going to spend any of your political currency, which was slender for Harris, on talking about the plight of young men, without acknowledging this huge, terrible thing that was happening to women, you weren't using your political currency very well, which opened up the door entirely to Trump to walk in and just do the bromance. The broligarchy is on fire in the United States, and it is part of a long-term misogynistic trend for him and his compadres. But young men are chuffed about it. There's a guy that they can relate to. Forever alone, unless you can pay for it.
Jim, what do you think about this?
Well, on the data parts of it, men still make quite a bit more than women on average. So, I think that there isn't a strong argument to be made at all that somehow
35-year-old men make more money than 35-year-old women?
Sure. Oh, yeah. Yeah, okay. Definitely. Now, the gap is closing, and the education gap has switched. So younger women have more education on average than younger men. But it's impossible to argue on the basis of data that men have suffered because of women's progress. Women have made progress, and that's very good. That's good for them. That's good for families. That's good for the economy. But it hasn't come at the expense of men. Now, perhaps some of those structural changes that we've been talking about earlier, the evaporation of some of the traditional manufacturing jobs after free trade, or the deunionization of some parts of the economy, you could argue some of those changes affected men particularly hard, and might have fostered obviously an anger, a righteous anger, but an openness to false scapegoats. So, combined with the challenges to misogyny in all areas of life, as we have to keep challenging it, some men will say, no, I'm suffering and it's the women's fault. And that has come out in political and cultural ways. But there's not an economic foundation for it. Everyone is trying to get by, as we've been talking about. And women's real wages have grown. Men's real wages have grown. Not as fast as women's real wages have grown, but they've both grown. And there's no economic basis for men to say, I've been screwed because of women.
There you go. All right, I'm going to have to warn you, don't look at the comments on this episode on YouTube. Because my YouTube audience skews a little male and a little conservative, and I got a feeling they're going to light us up like a Christmas tree. Anyway, thank you for doing this so much. Really appreciate David. This conversation.
It's Thanks always a great pleasure.
Okay. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, our sponsor, CN, Forestry for the Future, and Fidelity. And thank all you Herle Burly-ites who watched or listened to this show. Keep your ears open. Keep learning new things. Keep absorbing new information. That'll get us to the right place. All right. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you next week. Bye, Armine. Bye, Jim.
Bye-bye.
Bye, David. Bye, Jim.